The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Jade Pavilion, casting long, golden rectangles across the hand-carved mahogany floors. It was the kind of silence that smelled of ancient cedar and expensive air filtration, a sanctuary designed for the city's elite to escape the chaotic honking of San Francisco's financial district. Li Wei moved through the space like a ghost, his presence so subtle it was almost invisible. At 65, his back was still straight, though his hands bore the calluses of a lifetime of labor. He wore a simple, faded linen tunic that had been washed so many times the fabric felt like soft butter against his skin. To the average passerby, he looked like a man who had been forgotten by time, a relic of an old world assigned to clean the dust off a new one. He moved a microfiber cloth over an antique gongfu tea table with rhythmic precision, his mind focused on the quiet dignity of the wood. The piece was shattered when the heavy glass doors swung open with a violent thud. Bradley Thorne didn't just walk into a room, he invaded it. His Italian leather loafers clicked aggressively against the wood, a sound that signaled a man who was used to people moving out of his way. Brad was in his late 30s, wearing a navy blue suit that cost more than most people's annual rent, his hair gelled into a stiff, immovable wave. He was mid-sentence, barking into a gold-rimmed smartphone while his two junior associates trailed behind him like nervous shadows. He didn't look at the art on the walls or the thousand-year-old tea artifacts. He only looked at his watch, tapping the face of it with a manicured fingernail. He came to a halt in front of the main service counter, his eyes raking over Li Wei with an expression of immediate, visceral disgust. He didn't see a human being, he saw an obstacle. Brad snapped his fingers, the sharp sound echoing through the quiet tea house like a gunshot. He didn't wait for Li Wei to look up before he started speaking, his voice dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from deep-seated entitlement. He demanded the most expensive caffeine hit they had, his tone suggesting that the very air Li Wei breathed was an inconvenience to him. When Li Wei didn't immediately drop his cloth to scramble toward the register, Brad leaned over the counter, his expensive cologne clashing violently with the delicate scent of jasmine in the air. He called him Grandpa, his lip curling into a sneer as he mocked the old man's slow, methodical movements. The tension in the room spiked when Brad turned to his associates, laughing loudly about how some people were just born to be relics. He gestured vaguely at Li Wei's tunic, asking if the uniform came with a manual on how to move faster than a turtle. Li Wei didn't flinch. He simply tucked the cloth into his belt and looked Brad directly in the eye. It wasn't a look of anger, but one of profound, unsettling patience. This only seemed to infuriate Brad further. He began to pace, his movements erratic and clumsy in his agitation. In his haste to check a notification on his phone, his elbow caught a lacquered tray sitting on the edge of a nearby display. The sound of ceramic shattering filled the room as four delicate, hand-painted tasting cups hit the floor, exploding into 100 white shards. The silence that followed was deafening. Instead of an apology, a dark flush crept up Brad's neck. He looked down at the mess and then immediately pointed a trembling finger at Li Wei. He didn't just raise his voice, he roared. He blamed the old man for standing in the way of progress, for being a clumsy oaf who shouldn't be allowed near anything of value. He demanded to see a manager, his voice rising in pitch as he claimed his morning was being ruined by incompetent service staff who didn't know their place. Sarah, the young manager of the pavilion, hurried out from the back office, her face pale. She was a woman in her late 20s, professional and sharp, but there was a flicker of something deeply personal in her eyes as she looked at the broken ceramic and then at Li Wei. She stepped between them, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to de-escalate the situation, offering to move Brad to a private booth. But Brad wasn't looking for a booth, he was looking for a target. He mocked her for taking orders from a dishwasher, and sneered at the idea that this old relic belonged in a high-end establishment. Li Wei stood amidst the shards of the broken cups, his face a mask of calm. He looked at the $20 bill Brad had just crumpled and tossed at his feet as hush money for the mess. Brad told him to keep the change for a better haircut, his laughter harsh and grating against the serene backdrop of the tea house. As Brad's eyes landed on a rare, $50,000 aged pu'er tea cake protected behind a glass case, he demanded a tasting of that dirt water, his voice full of mocking challenge. Li Wei finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying a weight that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He told the young man that tea reveals the heart of the one who drinks it, and warned him to be careful of what he asked to taste. Brad just laughed, oblivious to the fact that the storm he had just started was about to wash him away. The mist clung to the jagged peaks of the Yunnan mountains like a damp shroud, heavy with the scent of wet earth and ancient pine. 40 years ago, Li Wei had stood on those very slopes, his lungs burning with the thin, cold air as he gripped a rusted iron spade. He wasn't a man of industry back then, he was a protector of the soil. His family's tea trees were gnarled and silver with age, some having survived for centuries, whispering secrets to those patient enough to listen. But the modern world didn't care for secrets, it cared for square footage. A corrupt local official, a man with a belly full of stolen banquets and a heart like a hollow drum, had arrived with a fleet of bulldozers. He wanted the land for a chemical factory, and he saw the tea farmers as nothing more than weeds to be uprooted. Li Wei remembered the day they came to seize the deed, the way the official had spat on the roots of a 300-year-old tree, calling it useless firewood. The struggle that followed had been slow and agonizing. To save his infant daughter and give her a chance at a life where her worth wasn't determined by the land she stood on, Li Wei had to make a choice that tore his soul in two. He sold his remaining harvest for pennies, took on back-breaking debts, and worked until his fingernails bled just to secure a single passage to America. He arrived in San Francisco with nothing but a handful of dried tea leaves and a daughter who didn't understand why her father's hands were always shaking from exhaustion. He spent decades in the shadows of the city, scrubbing floors in the very buildings he would one day own, counting every nickel and dime while his stomach growled in the middle of the night. He endured the sneers of men in suits who looked through him as if he were made of glass, also Sarah could go to a good school and never have to know the weight of a mountain on her back. While Li Wei was learning the quiet dignity of sacrifice, a young Bradley Thorne was learning a very different lesson thousands of miles away. In the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of an elite New England prep school, Brad's father had sat him down in a leather-bound study that smelled of expensive scotch and old money. His father hadn't taught him about the roots of trees, he taught him about the hierarchy of men. He told Brad that the world was a chessboard divided into two colors, those who moved the pieces and those who were moved. He told him that empathy was a luxury for the weak and that the only way to ensure respect was to demand it through fear and fortune. Brad watched his father treat their household staff like disposable appliances, and he grew up believing that the volume of his voice was more important than the truth of his words. He learned to equate a person's value with the brand of their shoes, building a shell of arrogance to hide the fact that he had never actually built anything of his own. In the present day, back inside the quiet elegance of the Jade Pavilion, the two worlds collided with a deafening silent crash. Li Wei looked down at the jagged scar running across his palm, a permanent reminder of the day he fought the bulldozers in Yunnan. He traced the line of the old wound, his mind flickering between the cold mist of the mountains and the sterile air conditioning of the city. The hidden truths of his journey sat heavy in his chest. He wasn't just a man cleaning a floor, he was a man who had conquered a legacy of poverty through sheer, unyielding will. He looked up at Brad, who was currently tapping his foot with a restless, frantic energy, oblivious to the history standing right in front of him. Brad noticed the stare and his eyes narrowed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated irritation. He snapped his fingers in Li Wei's face, the sound sharp and disrespectful. He asked the old man what he was looking at, calling him a peasant and demanding that he stop daydreaming and go fetch the boiling water. To Brad, the silence from the man in the linen tunic was a sign of stupidity or submission, a confirmation of the prejudices his father had etched into his brain decades ago. He didn't see the fire behind Li Wei's eyes or the way the old man's shoulders squared with a sudden, regal grace. Li Wei realized in that moment that Bradley was the exact same breed of man as the official who had tried to steal his mountain. The scenery had changed, the suits were more expensive, and the language was different, but the poison was the same. The tension in the tea house thickened, no longer just a conflict over a broken cup, but a collision of two life philosophies where one was about to be shattered just like the porcelain on the floor. The air inside the Jade Pavilion grew thick and suffocating, vibrating with the kind of tension that precedes a violent storm. Bradley Thorne was no longer content with mere insults, he wanted a total surrender. He lunged forward, his movements jagged and aggressive, and snatched a delicate porcelain gaiwan straight out of Li Wei's hands. The hot water sloshed over the sides, narrowly missing Li Wei's fingers, but Bradley didn't even blink. He held the lid open, peering into the bowl with a theatrical scowl, before he began to perform a grotesque, exaggerated mockery of the ceremony. He twisted his face into a squint, bobbing his head in a cruel caricature, and began to speak in a high-pitched, fake accent that cut through the room like a jagged blade. He shouted that he wanted his tea now and told the old man to stop the dancing and the nonsense. The few other patrons in the shop froze, their teacups suspended halfway to their mouths. Some looked down at their laps in shame, while others stared in wide-eyed horror, but no one moved to stop him. The humiliation deepened as Bradley's associate, a man named Chad who wore an identical smirk and a fleece vest, pulled out his smartphone. He didn't intervene, instead, he stepped back to get a better angle, the red light of the recording indicator glowing like a predatory eye. He whispered to Bradley to do the accent again, laughing about how this was going to go viral and how they were making content. The cruelty felt orchestrated, a public stoning in the age of social media. In the corner, a young girl no older than 6 tugged on her mother's sleeve, her voice a small, piercing trill in the silence. She asked why the man was being so mean to the nice grandfather. The mother tried to shush her, but Bradley spun around, his face contorted with rage. He snapped at the mother to control her kid and told her that if she couldn't keep her brat quiet in a premium establishment, they should both get out. Seeing an opportunity to finish what he started, Bradley deliberately tilted the gaiwan, pouring the steaming liquid over his own Italian silk tie and onto the expensive cuff of his shirt. He let out a theatrical yelp of pain, though the tea had cooled significantly. He began to scream that he had been attacked, that the crazy old man had intentionally scalded him. He looked around the room, his eyes wild and demanding. He shouted that he wanted the police called and that he was going to sue the shop into the ground. He demanded that Li Wei be fired on the spot, banned from the district, and thrown into a cell where he belonged. Sarah rushed forward, her hands shaking as she reached for a towel, but Bradley shoved her hand away. He pointed at the floor, at the puddles of tea and the shards of broken porcelain from earlier. He told Li Wei that if he wanted to keep his pathetic job for even one more minute, he needed to get down on his knees and scrub the stains off his shoes. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 1,000 years of dignity being tested. Li Wei looked at the floor, then at the man who thought he could buy the world. He felt the isolation of the moment, the way the room had turned into a theater of injustice where he was the only victim. But he wasn't entirely alone. In the far corner of the room, tucked away in a shadow-draped booth, sat Mrs. Gable. She was a woman of legendary reputation, the city's most feared food and culture critic, known for a pen that could open a restaurant or close a career in a single paragraph. She sat perfectly still, her leather-bound notebook open, her eyes moving between Bradley's screaming face and Li Wei's calm one. She saw the truth that the camera phone missed. She saw the calculated malice in Bradley's spill and the quiet, mountain-like strength in the old man who refused to break. The breaking point had been reached, and while Bradley thought he was winning, he was merely digging the grave of his own reputation in front of the one person who could truly bury it. The atmosphere in the tea house was thick with the suffocating stench of Bradley's triumph. He stood over Li Wei, chest puffed out, waiting for the old man to succumb to the ultimate humiliation. Sarah's eyes were rimmed with red, her hands trembling as she looked between her grandfather and the screaming man threatening to destroy their livelihood. She knew what she had to do, even if it felt like a betrayal. With a voice that barely rose above a whisper, she told Li Wei that perhaps it was best if he took the rest of the day off, that he should just head home and rest. Bradley erupted into a jagged, ugly laugh, clapping his hands together like a child at a circus. He sneered that, taking the day off, was just a polite way of saying he was fired, and he told the old rat to make sure he didn't steal any silverware on his way out. Li Wei didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply stood up, brushed a stray bit of dust from his faded tunic, and gave Sarah a look of such profound, quiet reassurance that her breath hitched in her throat. As Li Wei walked toward the heavy glass doors, the bell chiming a mournful note upon his exit, Bradley pulled out his phone to check his stock alerts, his face illuminated by the smug glow of a man who believed he had just cleansed the world of a nuisance. But the glow didn't last. His phone didn't show a green upward arrow. It vibrated with a frantic, incoming call from his boss, the senior partner at Thorne & Associates. Bradley stepped away from his laughing friends, his voice dropping into a sycophantic hush as he answered. But the voice on the other end wasn't congratulatory. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated panic. His boss screamed that their firm's largest anchor investor, the mysterious entity that provided 60% of their operating capital, had just pulled every cent out of their accounts. Worse, the investor had cited a gross violation of ethical standards as the reason. Bradley's knees felt suddenly weak, the color draining from his face until he looked as white as the broken porcelain on the floor. Outside, in the crisp San Francisco air, the transformation was already beginning. Li Wei didn't head for a bus stop or a subway entrance. He walked 10 paces to the curb where a sleek, midnight black sedan was idling. The driver, a man in a crisp suit, stepped out immediately and held the door open with a deep, respectful bow. Li Wei reached into the car and pulled out a charcoal gray blazer, sliding it over his shoulders. The transition was seamless. The janitor was gone, and in his place stood a titan of industry. He looked back at the tea house for a brief moment, not with anger, but with the cold, focused precision of a grandmaster moving his final piece. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the architect of the collapse Bradley was currently feeling through his phone. Li Wei settled into the leather seat and pulled a small, high-tech tablet from the seat back pocket. His mindset had shifted completely. The patience he had shown in the face of Bradley's racism wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the slow draw of a bowstring. He looked at the live security feed from the tea house, which he had installed himself months ago, capturing every second of Bradley's mock accent and the intentional spill. He tapped a button, sending the high-definition file to a private legal server. He told his driver that he didn't want Bradley Thorne merely unemployed. He wanted the man to understand exactly what happens when you try to burn down a garden that doesn't belong to you. As the car pulled away from the curb, Li Wei took a slow, deep breath, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The long game had begun, and the first move had already left his opponent gasping for air. Bradley was celebrating a victory in a game that had already ended, while Li Wei was just beginning to pour the tea. The following days were a study in silent, calculated destruction. Li Wei did not spend his time brooding in anger. Instead, he moved through his glass-walled penthouse office with the same meditative grace he used when brewing tea. He sat behind a desk of reclaimed ancient oak, surrounded by flickering monitors that tracked the heartbeat of the global markets. To the world, Li Wei was a ghost, a name on a corporate charter that nobody could quite trace, but in this room, he was the architect of reality. His loyal assistant, Marcus, moved quietly across the plush carpet, laying down a thick folder bound in black leather. Marcus didn't need to say much. The look of grim satisfaction on his face said it all. They had spent the last 48 hours peeling back the layers of Bradley Thorne's professional life like a rotted onion. The deeper they dug, the more the stench of corruption filled the room. Bradley hadn't just been a bully at the tea house, he was a predator in the boardroom. The documents revealed a systematic pattern of skimming tiny, fractional diversions of client funds into offshore accounts that Bradley used to pay for his $5,000 suits and the Ferrari he preened in. Li Wei traced a finger over a forensic accounting report, his eyes cold. He wasn't just looking at numbers, he was looking at the stolen dreams of the families Bradley had defrauded. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly, and told Marcus to coordinate with the district attorney's office. He wanted the trap set with such precision that there would be no room for Bradley to wiggle free. Every phone call to high-powered lawyers and every secret meeting with board members was a steady, rhythmic beat of a drum counting down to Bradley's end. While Li Wei was orchestrating a symphony of justice, Bradley Thorne was living in a state of delusional grandeur. He was currently perched at the center of a rooftop bar, the city lights twinkling beneath his feet like a carpet of diamonds. He was on his fourth glass of vintage scotch, his face flushed with the kind of heat that comes from unearned confidence. He regaled his circle of sycophants with a loud, animated retelling of the old rat at the tea house, making sure to exaggerate his own heroism in the face of what he called peasant aggression. He told them he had finally cleaned up the neighborhood and that his promotion to senior partner was a done deal, scheduled to be announced at the upcoming Heritage Tower Gala. He laughed so hard he nearly choked, his eyes gleaming with the hollow pride of a man who thinks he has won the game while the board is being pulled out from under him. However, the cracks were starting to show, even if Bradley was too drunk on his own ego to notice. When the bill for the round of drinks arrived, the server returned a moment later, looking uncomfortable. He leaned in and whispered that Bradley's corporate card had been declined. Bradley's laugh died in his throat for a split second, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his eyes before he masked it with a roar of indignation. He accused the waiter of having a faulty machine and threw down a personal card, chalking it up to a bank error caused by his firm's massive new transitions. He didn't see the waiter's skeptical glance or notice the way his friends exchanged a look of sudden, sharp doubt. The celebratory atmosphere felt brittle, like thin ice beginning to groan under a heavy weight. Back at his private residence, Li Wei sat in a room that smelled of cedar and dried leaves. He was performing a private tea ceremony, his movements slow and intentional. He was brewing a specific variety of bitter melon tea, a brew that was almost unbearable on the first sip but transformed into a deep, lingering sweetness by the third pour. He watched the steam rise in a delicate spiral, reflecting on the nature of karma. He thought about how men like Bradley believed that power was a hammer used to crush the weak, never realizing that true power was the mountain that simply waited for the storm to pass. He closed his eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the city, knowing that in 24 hours, the man who had mocked his heritage and spat on his dignity would walk into a room expecting a crown, only to find a mirror reflecting the thief he truly was. The grind was over, the trap was set. All that was left was to pour the tea. The grand ballroom of the Heritage Tower was a cathedral of excess, dripping in gold leaf and illuminated by crystal chandeliers that looked like frozen explosions of light. The air was a thick, cloying mixture of expensive floral arrangements and the sharp metallic tang of high-end cologne. This was the pinnacle of San Francisco's social hierarchy, a place where fortunes were toasted and lives were decided over flutes of vintage champagne. Bradley Thorne moved through the crowd like he owned the oxygen in the room. He was dressed in a bespoke tuxedo that hugged his frame with arrogant precision, his chest puffed out as he accepted premature congratulations from colleagues who were eager to ride the coattails of his expected promotion. He was at the top of the world, or so he believed, unaware that he was standing on the edge of a precipice. His arrogance reached a fever pitch when he spotted a familiar face near the hors d'oeuvres station. Sarah, the manager from the tea house, was standing there in a sophisticated emerald dress that shimmered under the chandeliers. She looked radiant, possessing a quiet confidence that seemed to agitate Bradley's very soul. He marched over to her, his sneer returning with practiced ease. He didn't greet her, he looked at her with a mixture of pity and malice, loudly asking if the janitor's granddaughter had snuck in through the service entrance to empty the trash. He waved a hand toward a nearby security guard, demanding that the girl be escorted out before she contaminated the evening with her presence. He was so busy performing for his fiancée, a woman in a designer gown who giggled into her silk fan, that he didn't notice the way the people around him were beginning to stare, not at Sarah, but at him. The atmosphere shifted from celebratory to surgical as the board of directors began to congregate at the center of the hall. Bradley straightened his tie, his heart hammering with a greedy anticipation. He saw a man standing with his back to the crowd, surrounded by the city's most powerful investors. The man was wearing a suit of such exquisite tailoring that it made Bradley's own tuxedo look like a cheap rental. Thinking this was the man who would hand him his promotion, Bradley strode forward, his voice booming with a false, oily warmth. He tapped the man on the shoulder, leaning in with a wink. He asked if the janitor from the tea house had followed him here to clean the toilets, laughing at his own joke as if it were the height of wit. He waited for the man to turn around and join in the laughter, his hand already extended to shake on the deal of a lifetime. When the man slowly turned around, the world seemed to stop spinning. The room fell into a silence so absolute you could hear the soft fizzing of champagne bubbles 3 tables away. It was Li Wei, but it wasn't the humble man in the faded linen tunic Bradley had mocked and spat upon. This Li Wei stood taller, his eyes sharp and commanding, possessing a presence that seemed to dwarf the very room they were in. The chairman of the board stepped forward, his head bowed in a gesture of profound respect, and greeted Li Wei as the founder and majority owner of the entire heritage conglomerate. Bradley's hand remained frozen in midair, his fingers trembling as the realization hit him like a physical blow. The peasant he had tried to humiliate was the very man who held the keys to his future, his career, and his freedom. Li Wei didn't say a word at first. He simply raised his teacup, the steam curling around his face like a silent judge, and watched as the blood drained from Bradley's face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The silence in the ballroom was no longer peaceful, it was a vacuum, sucking the very air out of Bradley Thorne's lungs. He stood paralyzed, his hand still awkwardly extended toward the man he had called a peasant less than 48 hours ago. The transition was so absolute, so devastatingly complete, that Bradley's brain struggled to process the reality before him. Li Wei stood like a monument of carved obsidian, his eyes possessing a terrifying clarity that seemed to pierce through Bradley's expensive tuxedo and lay bare the hollow, trembling coward beneath. The chairman of the board cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gavel. He stepped forward and formally introduced Chairman Li Wei, the founder of the Heritage Group and the silent architect of the very fund Bradley had been leeching from for years. Bradley's mouth worked soundlessly, like a fish gasping on a dry deck. He tried to force a laugh, a desperate, wheezing sound that died instantly in the frigid air of the room. He stammered that there had to be a mistake, that this man was a janitor, a nobody from a dusty tea shop. He looked around at the faces of the elite, searching for a single ally, but he found only a wall of stony, judgmental silence. Even his fiancée had stepped back, her face a mask of horrified embarrassment as she physically distanced herself from the man who was rapidly becoming radioactive. Li Wei didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. He simply signaled to the massive high-definition screens lining the ballroom walls. The lights dimmed, and suddenly, the room was filled with the sounds of the Jade Pavilion. It was the security footage, but the quality was so sharp it felt like a window into the past. Every guest in the room watched in vivid detail as Bradley performed his racist mockery, heard the high-pitched, mocking accent, and saw him intentionally spill the tea and demand that an elderly man get on his knees to scrub his shoes. The sounds of Bradley's laughter on the tape clashing with the absolute silence of the ballroom was a violence all its own. Bradley felt the eyes of every titan of industry in the city burning into him. He felt the weight of his father's disappointment and the crushing realization that he had not just lost a promotion, he had lost his world. In a desperate, frantic attempt to save himself, Bradley grabbed a cup of tea from a passing waiter's tray. His hands were shaking so violently that the liquid slopped over the rim, staining his white silk shirt, the exact same way he had stained his own tie to frame Li Wei. He tried to take a deep, stabilizing gulp, his eyes darting around the room as he prepared to launch into a lie about how the video was a deepfake or a misunderstanding. But as the hot liquid hit his throat, his breath hitched in a spasm of pure, unadulterated panic. He began to choke, a jagged, wet sound that tore through the silence. He bent double, clutching his throat, his face turning a dark, bruised purple as he sputtered and gasped for air. It was the ultimate, poetic irony. The man who had mocked the culture of tea was now being brought to his knees by it. Li Wei stepped forward, looking down at the gasping man with a face that held no malice, only a cold, clinical disappointment. He told Bradley that he had once said tea reveals the heart of the one who drinks it, and tonight, Bradley's heart had finally spoken. He told him that his career was not over because of a video, but because the forensic audit was complete. He revealed that the $4 million Bradley had embezzled to fund his delusions of grandeur had been tracked to the last cent. As Bradley slumped to the floor, coughing and desperate, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Two uniformed police officers moved through the crowd with a purpose that froze the heart. Li Wei delivered the final, crushing blow, informing Bradley that the police weren't there for a disturbance, but for him. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut over Bradley's manicured wrists was the only music left in the room, a sharp, metallic finale to a life built on the suffering of others. Bradley Thorne didn't leave the gala with a promotion. He left in the back of a squad car, a broken man who had finally learned that while power can be bought, dignity is a mountain that cannot be moved. The flash of the police cruiser's lights against the rainy pavement marked the final curtain call for Bradley Thorne. As he was led away in a tuxedo that now felt like a straitjacket, the ballroom air seemed to clear, the toxic weight of his presence evaporating. His assets were frozen by mourning, his reputation incinerated by a viral video that no amount of expensive crisis management could erase. Within months, the man who once looked down on the world from a glass tower was reduced to a number in a state penitentiary. His only companions the echoing silence of a cell and the bitter memory of a tea he never learned to respect. Li Wei did not revel in the destruction, he simply returned to the quiet world he had built. He stood once more in the Jade Pavilion, but the sign on the door had changed. It was now officially, the Mountain of Patience, a sanctuary where the price of a cup of tea was not measured in dollars, but in the decency one brought through the door. 5 years passed with the steady, rhythmic grace of a steeping brew. In the outskirts of the city, a man with hollowed eyes and a jagged, unkempt beard stood on the shoulder of a freeway. Bradley Thorne, now a shadow of his former self, clutched a rusted trash grabber, wearing an orange safety vest that had faded under the relentless sun. He moved slowly, picking up discarded plastic bottles and cigarette butts, his back aching from a kind of labor he had once mocked. A sleek black sedan slowed down as it passed his section of the road, and for a fleeting second, Bradley saw his own reflection in the tinted glass. A man who had everything and threw it away because he thought he was better than the soil he walked on. He looked up and saw a massive billboard towering over the highway. It featured a vibrant, smiling Sarah standing next to a dignified Li Wei, announcing the launch of a global foundation dedicated to providing microloans and mentorship to immigrant entrepreneurs. The headline read, "True power is built on respect." Bradley looked down at a discarded paper cup lying in the dirt, a cup from the Jade Pavilion. He picked it up, tracing the logo with a shaking finger. He didn't feel the burning rage of the past, he felt only a cold, hollowed-out clarity. He finally understood that the old man he had tried to break was never his enemy, his own arrogance was. He realized that the world had moved on without him, not because he lacked money, but because he lacked a soul. He stood there for a long time, the wind whipping the orange vest against his thin frame, finally recognizing the value of the things that cannot be bought or sold. Li Wei sat in the garden of the new community center he had funded, watching his granddaughter teach a group of local children the art of the tea ceremony. The air was filled with the scent of jasmine and the sound of innocent laughter. He held a cup of the same pu'er Bradley had once called dirt water, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He knew that the legacy he was leaving behind wasn't the buildings or the billions, but the lesson that every human being carries a mountain of dignity within them. He looked up at the sky, a quiet smile touching his lips. Karma is not a punishment, it is a mirror. It simply reflects back what we choose to show the world. He took a slow, peaceful sip of his tea, knowing that the garden was finally clean, the roots were deep, and the harvest was sweet. Respect is a currency that never devalues, and those who try to bankrupt others of their dignity will always find themselves with nothing left to spend.